Associate Director of International Policy at the IPPR, and extremely pleased to welcome you all here. This is the latest event in the Development Now series, which is IPPR's international programme. We're undertaking it jointly with the UK and World programme at Chatham House. I'm genuinely so looking forward to the conversation today with two extremely eminent, important thinkers who are working to try to make progress on this, one of the central challenges of today's development landscape, which is climate finance. Before we dive into the details of the conversation, I wanted to give the floor to Olivia O'Sullivan, who's my co-convener in this series and the Director of the UK and the World programme at Chatham House, to say a little bit about the overall intention of this series.
Thank you so much, Laura, and my role here is to just very warmly welcome you all and underline, as Laura said, that this is part of a relatively informal series that we are co-convening between Chatham House's UK and the World programme, of which I am the Director, and IPPR's International Policy programme, where we want to ask some relevant questions about where the UK takes its development policy now. I think probably everyone in this room would agree that development policy in this country is at something of a crossroads. It's a good time to be thinking about what tools, what approaches, but also what narratives, stories, model of development, ways of working with other countries, approach to delivering prosperity, better outcomes around the world we in the UK and decision makers in the UK government should be taking. We know, by the way, that this series is one of a number of lots of different convenings that actually many people in this room are bringing together as well. And we're just one strand in a rich conversation that we're very glad to be part of. As Laura said, climate is a really important part of this puzzle. It feeds into all of those questions and all of those themes that we've mentioned. So we're really pleased to be convening this discussion as part of the series. We're going to slightly regroup after this one and have a think about what the next discussion should be about. So that's certainly something we'd love to hear from everybody here on as well. So if you have ideas afterwards, you should really bring people together on this or that specific question, do come and grab both of us and do tell us about it and be part of it. Thank you. Back over to you, Laura.
Thank you. Okay, to today's conversation. As we saw reflected again at the start of this week, climate finance is an absolutely pivotal component of addressing the climate crisis. Without it, the transition will not happen. And the debate on climate finance is also illustrative of how much the discussion about development has changed over the past few decades. So if we look back to 1997, when Labour entered government the last time, climate change was only on the edges of the conversation. The scale of finance under discussion was billions, not trillions, and ODA was the central mechanism for progress. The contributions made by concessional finance or mobilised private finance were not front and centre in the debate. We are no longer in that world. And partner countries like the UK are continuing to try to evolve their focus, their offer, their instruments and their approach to meet needs. Our two speakers today are central actors in the global effort to meet this challenge. So on my far left, Avinash Persaud has a career across private and public finance and academia. He's currently the Special Advisor for Climate Change to the President of the Inter-American Development Bank, and is also one of the architects of the Bridgetown Initiative, which has driven so much progress in this area. Rachel Kyte similarly has an eminent career across academia, public finance, and she was recently appointed as the UK Special Representative on Climate. So, very much welcome to both of you. I'll ask each of our speakers in turn to give an opening set of remarks regarding how they see the climate finance challenge today. How are we doing? Where is there the most promise? And where should policymakers put their focus? I'll then ask a few questions of them before I turn the conversation over to the floor. Couple of notes. When you want to speak, please indicate your name and organisation before making your intervention. And please note this is a public event which we're recording and we will put on our website. Okay, with that, over to you, Avinash.
Thank you. It's been a long while since I was described as being on the far left. It did happen once. Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks to IPPR, thanks to Chatham House. It's great to see you all. I'm sure Rachel and I would much rather conversation with you, so we'll try and keep these opening remarks as modest as possible. But we would also, I think, like to deepen the conversation beyond the kind of superficial places that often get stuck, to delve a bit deeper. And I would begin by saying that we both have climate in our titles, but certainly in my case, I'm not as young as I look. And we realize that there's a lot more to development than climate. That climate is essential to development, it's critical. Development is essential to climate impacts, but there's a lot of things we need to do on development that are not directly climate related. The development banks are pitching that they're going to say 40%, they're going to aim for 40% of all their loans are climate related. The Inter-American Development Bank is going for 50%. The way they count that is actually makes that an even tougher target than it may appear. So on climate adaptation, making things more resilient to the changing climate, only the extra resilient bit is counted as climate adaptation. So if you're building a bridge and you've added 10% to the cost because you've made it a bit more resilient than the other bridge you built, only that 10% counts as climate adaptation. So 50% target, counting it in that way, I think is quite an ambitious level. It's a good place to start, and there's a lot of development outside. The other thing I'd say about climate finance is that it's one of those subjects where when you start disaggregating it, it looks very different than the top level aggregated numbers. The aggregated numbers shows that there has been an increase in climate finance, quite a significant increase, not to where we need to be, but a significant change. The problem is that almost all of that is happening in developed countries. Not all, but a lot of it in developed countries rather than developing countries. A lot of it is private sector. The private sector is doing a lot more, is doing mitigation rather than adaptation. So when you start breaking down these things, you find a very different picture. I think we would say there's definitely a very strong need for climate finance to go across the border to to the south. Rachel and I both sit on the independent high-level expert group on climate finance. That group came up with a number of $2.4 trillion is what developing countries need every year, covering mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And just one point on this, I came pretty late to climate finance, spurred on by a very challenging job I was given to try and rescue an island from a hurricane that had devastated. They'd lost 226% of GDP in 4 hours. I remember having a 12-point economic plan within a week because we had to give people the impression, the completely false impression, that there was a government thinking about a plan because that country had lost everything. But I remember observing that people used to use the words climate mitigation and adaptation as if it was one kind of German word together, right? Adaptation, mitigation. And I learned that these things are very, very different. You've got to break them out. They're different things and they require different kinds of finance. Mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Solar and wind power technology since 2015. Since 2015, these things are profitable, especially in developed countries. The old days of having to have a public subsidy to make it work are no longer there in developed countries. In developing countries, they're not profitable. The cost of capital, bringing that capital from rich countries to poor countries is very, very high, and it makes those things not profitable. But that is different than adaptation. Adaptation, of course, is about making ourselves more resilient to the climate that has already changed and the climate that is change that's baked in already. That doesn't generate revenues. That generates huge savings. The estimates are that $1 spent on resilience gives you $4 or more in savings. And therefore, it makes sense for developing countries to be able to borrow long-term and low cost to bring forward that investment in resilience. The savings will allow them to pay back that borrow. And then you've got loss and damage, which doesn't generate any savings, doesn't generate any revenues, and you need grant-based money to address those things. And as you're seeing, the horrors of Valencia, the horrors this year of the floods in Rio, and the thing I say about loss and damage is these three things are often put together, but they're quite different. We have a mitigation ambition. We have an adaptation goal and ambition. Loss and damage actually is being paid today. $100 billion plus is being paid in loss and damage. And you know who's paying it? It's the poorest people. They're paying it in lost jobs, in lost livelihoods, in lost homes, in lost incomes. It's being paid. What we need to try and do is stop them paying for it and have some people who are much more able to pay for it, especially if they've also made more of a contribution towards the problem. So let me end by saying three things that I think I'd like to urge the UK to be thinking about. On mitigation, now we're talking about technologies that are profitable except for the cost of capital. So we need to find ways of unblocking the flow of money from where capital is abundant and cheap to where it is scarce. You hear a lot of people saying, oh, we just need to help those countries finance it themselves. And that seems to be faintly ridiculous to me. Why is the cost of capital expensive in developing countries? It's because capital is scarce, because they don't have a lot of savings, and the amount of investment needs are high. So if you're going to put even more investment needs in that country to have the energy transition, their cost of capital will go up even more. We need to unblock the flow of money to these countries. And one of the biggest problems is foreign exchange risk, is country risk. Especially now that we have established technologies, established contracts. The UK led on supporting the development of the FX liquidity facility launched in Brazil this year in March. We need to deepen those things and we need to broaden them out across the world. On adaptation, savings, developing countries don't have the instruments of being able to borrow super long term. Most developing banks lending to them at 15 years, 20 years if they're lucky. We need 40-year, 50-year lending. Lending so long that they capture the country can capture the savings from that investment. And they need to borrow at low cost. The MDBs, the AAA rated institutions, can borrow at much lower cost than those countries can, and we need them to lend more. I suspect that the developed countries are not going to get anywhere close to the 300 billion target unless they're putting more capital into the MDBs. And what I would urge the UK to do is be a leader in the conditionality you're going to say to those MDBs. If you're going to put more capital in, here's what we want. And let's think about what those conditions are. The developing countries complain a lot about access. Access is difficult, especially for small countries, but every country. My final point on loss and damage, we're going to need new revenue streams. We need the UK to be playing a leading role in that. Joining the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force would be a big start. And let me end on that, because people think those things are very unrealistic. And I often point out that all we need is to actually use existing tools. So the United States of America, a place that doesn't like a lot of taxes, every barrel of oil produced in America today, every barrel of oil imported into America today faces a 9-cent levy that goes to the oil spill fund that now has $8 billion in it. If that 9-cent levy was extended towards coal and gas and extended globally, you'd have all the money you need for loss and damage. And of course, you're all familiar with the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund. One of the things that gets developing countries somewhat angry and resentful is that, look, they spent 30 years campaigning for loss and damage fund. 1968, biggest disaster in oil tanker, the Torrey Canyon, breaks up in the English Channel. black oil spilling onto the white beaches of Cornwall and Brittany. Within 2 years, there is an international law to have oil pollution compensation. Within 10 years, there's an oil pollution compensation fund. Whenever there's an oil spill anywhere in the world, every single oil tanker contributes to that, to the compensation around that fund. So we don't need brand new things. We need to use existing mechanisms and tools and extend them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation from IPPR and Chatham House. Always lovely to be on the right of Abby, or on the left from your perspective. So there we go. Well, so I'm going to try to avoid violently agreeing with Abby. So what to say? I think we, and for those of you who were, I'm looking at Fiona, but there were others who were in Baku at this recent COP. I think you see the world's converging, right? So for the longest time, there has been a conversation around climate finance that has emanated out of the Convention and out of the Paris Agreement. At the same time, propelled in large part by, in recent years, by the Bridgetown Agenda, we've been having a conversation around the fitness for purpose of the way in which we manage the global economy. And these two things have been coming closer and closer and closer, and now it's all one big conversation. And what it was confusing to a lot of the delegates and at COP, but also gets confused in treasuries and other parts of government across the world, is that depending on where you start the conversation, you may end up in a different place. So of course, for those people focused on climate finance, we're sort of coming in through language pre-Paris and in Paris, which is about the obligation of developed countries to transfer resources to developing countries. So that's climate finance, and then it's sort of branched out into other areas. But I think where we're also making progress is this conversation around financing climate. So you've got climate finance, which is sort of this thin vertical that has its origins in the convention, and then financing climate is this broader conversation about how we make our economies resilient, how we try to make them more fair in the teeth of the climate crisis, how the international financial architecture takes on board its need to meet its basic raison d'etre, but in the world of a climate crisis, and whether or not the climate crisis actually changes the raison d'etre of the international financial architecture. And then this question about all sources of revenue, right? So and that also has an anchor in the Paris Agreement. So how do you manage your economy so that there's more coherence in the way that you're managing your public finances domestically, your public finance internationally for those countries that have an obligation around overseas development assistance, and then how you are thinking about the role of your domestic capital markets and international investment, etc., etc. So often I think we have a conversation where we're talking past each other, because some people are coming in from the climate finance and some people are talking about financing climate. It's all of the above. And what we're seeing now is countries, sophisticated advanced economies, sophisticated developing economies, sitting back and trying to think through how do we continue to grow, how do we continue to develop, meet domestic needs, and then be part of an international effort. And I say that because I don't know what the final calculus is going to be of storm birds. But that's a domestic example of what emerging markets and developing economies are experiencing, with far fewer buffers, the inability to manage their economies in a way that means that they can spread that risk out. And so we can all understand what we're going through. And that should allow us to come to the table in a more positive way than perhaps has been the case in the past. And just as we get to that point, of course, we have some geopolitical winds which are hostile or cold, at least. And we saw that play out a little bit in Somebody reminded me the other day that when Trevor Manuel was the Minister of Finance in the first government after Mandela's victory, and somebody wanted to talk to him about development, and he turned around and said, no, I'm the Minister of Finance, development's my business, it's all about trade and investment. And I think that we're at that point now where we are talking about how to support the country to continue its development, obviously to develop with resilience, to develop in a low carbon way, to meet a net zero target at whatever point that's appropriate for them. But that's about the terms of trade and the ability to invest, domestic investment and international investment. So that brings us to the cost of capital and the terms of trade. And these now assume the centrepiece of how on earth we are going to manage the economy through the next few decades. And I think that it's very clear that that's not the comfort zone of most climate negotiators. And so there is a form issue, which we won't talk about today, but you can all go away and work on afterwards. Then I just want to talk about the fact that if we think about where's this 2.4 trillion going to come from that came from the international high-level expert group, which excludes China. So we're talking about domestic economies, and not because I'm trying to push the emphasis away from international transfers, but a country's own development will rest on the decisions that they make about their domestic investment priorities. And there are, I think, we also know that there are large amounts of capital that aren't being deployed for all kinds of good and bad reasons into countries' own development priorities. So I think in sub-Saharan Africa, less than 2% of GDP of any country is invested in their energy infrastructure. Now, that's not to replace international investment, and that shouldn't replace other international contributions, but it will be more sustainable for a country to find a way to invest more of their domestic savings in their own energy. And there are examples of how the international community can help that happen, supporting credit enhancement facilities and bringing other tools to bear that allow the country to become more of an investable proposition for its own domestic savings, right? So this is, again, this is not to push away from the international necessity or obligation that we have. So from a country's perspective, so then how do you track the international investment that you want? Well, that's very different, geography by geography, region by region. Part of my view is informed by sitting on investment committees of institutions that are investing, so it's not just theoretical. The investment climate is worsening. When the world gets insecure, capital comes home. Supply chains also come home, so it's much easier to get your hands on scarce kit within the solar supply chain at the moment if you're building something in a developed economy than if you're in a developing economy. And the disruptions to those supply chains mean that the cost of the project may have ballooned by 10, 12, 15 times. I mean, I can tell you from the board of the Private Infrastructure Development Group of renewable energy infrastructure investments in sub-Saharan Africa where the cost of the project has gone up even more than 15 times, right? So in a difficult world, it will be in emerging markets that it gets even more difficult, gets even more expensive to do what we need to do. So then where else will the investment be? So you improve your investment climate, so that means you've got to have investable projects, you've got to have the regulations in place, we've got to have the financial regulations in place. This has been underplayed by the multilateral development bank system for the last 15 years in particular, I think, where there's been less emphasis on this. But when we look at the rules and regulations for grids, for utilities and things like that, there are very few countries with a fit-for-purpose regulatory regime that would give investors confidence. So of course that's why we have multilateral development banks and others coming in to both improve that, but also provide the guarantee, provide the confidence for other investors. But I think since Glasgow in particular, we've sort of been on this journey of almost hyperventilation about the amount of private sector investment that could flow into emerging markets. It doesn't flow for very real reasons, which Abby talked about. And so at the end of the day, while we improve all of that, somebody somewhere has to take more risk. And I think there's a really fundamental question in the reform of the multilateral development banks. And they are reforming, and they should be congratulated, some going faster than others, is that at the end of the day, they are going to have to take more risk, which means that we are going to have to put more capital into them so that they can continue to balance their accounts. That global capital increase, I think, has become, the time frame for that, I think, is now something which maybe has more question marks associated with it than before November the 5th. But that it's necessary is unquestionable. There is no analysis that I've seen whereby the MDBs can stretch as much as we want them to without more capital. That doesn't mean to say we take the foot off the accelerator in terms of their need for reform, but at the end of the day, they are the most efficient way for us to look to deploy hard-earned overseas development assistance into a multilateral system to get to where we need to go to. So we've got reform. We've got the role of the IMF is also increasingly important, because I think that they have been saying all the right things about understanding the macroprudential risk of climate. Their research department pumps out really brilliant analysis of what's at stake if countries don't. It has a very nice policy trilemma, a triangle of like where governments have to be is between staying in power, balancing the books, and meeting your net zero target. Right? It's a very difficult landing zone for any country, but the IMF is very aware of that. And yet the evidence would be that in most countries that is not what the IMF is talking to country teams about. And so I think giving them a big push, especially because now Kristalina Georgieva has a second term, would be important. Now obviously the political climate in Washington changed, but I think that this is kind of fundamental. And there are issues where the IMF and the MDBs could be better aligned, in particular advice to governments around the pricing of carbon and the effectiveness of the pricing of carbon and the way in which they do that. We got agreement on Article 6, the carbon markets, after 9 years of trying in Baku, which is a significant step forward. And so now you see countries really trying to work through, how do I manage the carbon market potential? So do I have a trading system? Do I tax carbon in some way or other? What do I understand the impact of CBAMs growing around the world to be? How do I benefit from a voluntary carbon market that will now grow with hopefully with high integrity rules around it? You know, how should I manage all of this? And we see increasing, I think, confusion, but frustration, but a need to really get that right from many countries. I won't talk more about solidarity taxes and levies. This is the other stream of revenue that, as Abby has articulated, that is very important. So we need reform, we need more aggression from the multilateral development system, we need coherence between the IMF and the MDBs, and then for any given country, you know, how it uses its precious bilateral aid is very important. And so the last point I want to make is to go back to this question of adaptation. If everything now, if all development is now taking place in a climate crisis, and if all countries are seeing their GDP being shaved by climate events and climate impacts, and in some cases not shaved but obliterated, then will it be now or in the future sensible for adaptation to be measured as the increment on a development project that takes into account, you know, the different building materials you use for the bridge, or the fact that you're going to build something a bit higher or wider in order to resist the wind, or you're going to, you know, make the crops short cropped, heat resistant, etc. Is that incremental over the top of development? I mean, we're no longer in a world where development is okay, and then we just have to sort of pay a little bit more to make it resilient. And so I think that there is a profound intellectual challenge in front of the development industry around at what point do we understand that development finance is adaptation, or should be, or could be. And this discussion is just beginning, right? It pits people against against each other because it's happening in an atmosphere of declining ODA budgets and with pressures on ODA because of other political events around the world. And I think it's really important for the policy community to try to create space for that conversation to take place in a sensible and meaningful way and not have it weaponised as so much about climate finance, in particular around mitigation, is being. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I've scribbled down so many notes, I don't quite know where to start, but I think one of my thoughts is, what's stopping us? To what extent is a lack of progress in the technical space? So do we need better solutions, better ideas for to make progress? Or to what extent are we being stopped by politics? And if we're being stopped by politics, how do we build momentum towards moving these issues forward?
Well, clearly it's a bit of both. I think that we've done a lot of work on some of the technical obstacles. I think we've got more room to go to pulling those levers. As Rachel said, some of these definitions are not helpful. When I arrived at the IPP, I found that their definition of Paris alignment was really about emissions reduction. And if you are lending to developing countries who are building sea walls made out of reinforced concrete, that would not count as Paris aligned, and yet that's a very needy investment. The IMF's DSA, Debt Sustainability Analysis, really penalizes countries for investing in adaptation. If you need to bring forward investment today and become resilient today and not in 20 years' time, the problem is the IMF's DSA says, well, that's more debt, and you've got to get your debt to GDP number down to 60%. I also remember they got quizzed a lot in the case of the Barbados IMF program that I was involved in. You know, they were being quizzed by some journalists saying, are you taking into account climate? And the IMF said, yes, we are. If it wasn't for climate, we would have allowed them to have a higher debt to GDP ratio, but now because of climate, they need to have a lower one because they've got all these shocks happening, which means if a lower debt to GDP target is even more austerity. To create the fiscal space for them to deal with shocks, they wanted us to have more austerity. And so we were sort of saying, okay, that's not what we meant by taking climate into account. So the way to do that, I think, is to weight what is the debt for. If the debt is building resilience and savings, then it has a lower weight than the debts for consumption. So there's things we can do on definitions of Paris alignment, definitions of the DSA, developed country regulations too. You know, only 2% of developed country pension funds, insurance companies invest in emerging markets. Why? Because under Solvency II and Basel III, the main regulatory things, there is a geographical measure of risk. Are you an OECD country or a non-OECD country? If you're a non-OECD country, a developing country, you have to pay considerably more capital. And therefore, well, it makes the investments worse. But I would say at the end of the day, and I'm sure many of us at COP felt this, Rachel Reeves delivered her budget. She delivered her budget. Do we expect the UK to arrive at COP and suddenly find money that was not budgeted for? So we need to be doing work before COP. We need to be doing work on these budgets. We need to be doing work. So we could, all you could do at COP is change priorities within budgets. But if you actually want to change these budgets, you have to do a lot of work. And I think the sad reality is the politics is not moving in the right direction, it's slipping away. There isn't a growing consensus that we need to be sending more money to international climate finance. I think if anything, we're seeing, Jamie was calling it more nativist politics everywhere that we're seeing, a greater focus on nationalism. That's not encouraging this. So I think we need to do a lot more work on politics. We've got a little bit more room, levers on the technical stuff. We can do some more work there, but ultimately we do need political change.
Thank you, Rachel.
Are we Chatham House?
No, we're not, I'm afraid.
I've got nothing to say then. No, so I think I would agree. I think a lot of, well, I mean, let's be clear, right? That in many developed countries, the question of, I'm going to use an old-fashioned word, but the question of solidarity, right, has been made toxic deliberately, and has challenged, I think, the narrative that it makes a lot of sense for us to do things in the rest of the world because the consequences for our own security will be substantial if we don't, right? So, I mean, going to the very beginning of the environment, or well, the beginning for me anyway, as a youth activist around the pollution that was coming over the Iron Curtain, right? So I remember these profound debates in Europe about did it make more sense for us to increase the pollution control regimes in our own countries, or would it make more sense to spend some money in Poland, or trying to put scrubbers on their polluting power systems because it was just going up, coming down as acid rain, right? So there's a long history of spending money in other parts of the world to improve the world for everybody, and I think that that's intrinsically understood by the public at a level, but that's not the conversation we're engaged in. We're engaged in a conversation around whether or not we can survive while everybody else doesn't. And it's interesting that that's taken place because I remember when I worked for Ban Ki-moon, right? He would, he first started talking about there's no planet B. But he would talk to governments about the fact that if you're in a boat, you're at one end of the boat, you don't get to keep your feet dry if the bottom end, the other end of the boat is getting wet. So it's a really fairly basic concept, and that's under attack at the moment, which means that it's a difficult environment in which to budget, right, for an increase in that investment. But at the same time, the investment opportunity in the rest of the world, if we can change the regulatory rules, I think, which is very important, is substantial. So I think we announced in the first week of COP as the UK government, together with the climate investment funds. So the climate investment funds, remember, were created after Copenhagen, before the Green Climate Fund existed, as a way to put a pool of concessional finance and make it available to the MDBs to incentivise the MDBs to just go further, faster. And the Clean Technology Fund was the centrepiece. And I was working at the IFC at the time, and then at the bank, and we leveraged the climate investment funds to do the first wind power in Mexico, to do Ouazzazate, right, the beginning of Morocco's journey on the concentrated solar power voyage it's been on. That was, I think we put $700 million worth of concessional finance, which has leveraged tens of billions of private investment afterwards. So the climate investment fund is sitting there with a portfolio of high-performing renewable energy and other assets. And so for 11 years, they have been trying to come up with a way to access the markets. 11 years because they sat in my office at the very beginning discussing how to do it. That's how I remember. So last week or the week before, finally, after getting the agreement of all the shareholders and the agreement of the World Bank and everything that needed to happen, that portfolio can be turned into a bond and listed on the London Stock Exchange, raising immediately $3.5, I think, and the outer estimate is $7 billion, right? Which goes back to the Climate Investment Fund for further investment. So I think that there are a number of ways in which we can escape from the sort of poisonous, or the attempt at a poisonous dialogue, and show that actually our own savings, our own ability to invest, our own capital can be mobilised into good things. Now, what that doesn't do is deal with the growing need for funds for resilience and loss and damage in some of the most in some of the lowest income parts of the world. And that's just going to have to be paid for, and that's why we need, I think, to have a fulsome debate around new sources of revenue, whether that's solidarity taxes or other innovative ways. But you know, it isn't that we don't have enough cash in the world, it's that we have got to deploy it with different degrees of access and concessionality to where it's really needed. And my impression is that climate finance is siloed within government, right? And so one of the things I think that this new Labour government wants to do is, you know, obviously fiscally constrained like many other countries, is are we using every lever that we have as government in every place we show up as government to get the system to unblock itself a little bit? And I think that with creativity, there's a lot more that we can do. And then, of course, we have a conversation around budgets and spending reviews and fiscal, how we manage our own fiscal constraints. But I think there's a lot that we could do even now without appropriating different funds.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask one more and then I'll open up the conversation. So, Rachel, you've relatively recently been appointed to this new role. I'd love to hear what your priorities for the next 6 months are. Where will you invest your time? In which relationships and ideas? What do you want to try to push forward? And Avinash, you've been in your role longer, but it's still relatively new. And also, your institution, the Inter-American Development Bank, is entering a very different context with the election of Trump. So I'd love to know what's on your in tray for the next 6 months and where you'll be putting your efforts.
So I want to start by saying that I believe that what IDB and IDB Invest have been doing over the last 18 months, 2 years or whatever, is really what I'd love to see from across the NDB group. I mean, you know, solid leadership, leading by example, innovating at scale. Hopefully that continues, and that the decisions made on IDB Invest are not disrupted by changing one shareholder, but I mean really kudos, so I'll start there. I'll be really, I think it's important, the reason I took this position is because, so I report to both the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, Ed Miliband, and to the Foreign Secretary. So I'm not FCDO, I'm government, and I report to 2 ministries. And they are aligned, the Secretary of State and the Foreign Secretary. And the Foreign Secretary's Q speech, which I think many of you heard, is indicative of the vision, right? The vision is that we can put climate and nature at the heart of our foreign policy, that can help us deliver on net zero. It can help us protect the nature that we desperately need for the transitions we're going through and for the fairness we need in the world, and it can help reset our relationship, in particular with the global south. And it was which is something that I've long believed, and to have a Foreign Secretary articulate it, I was like, okay, I'm signing up. Right? So I'm honoured to take the role. What am I going to focus on? Finance, forests and energy. And that's not 6 months, that's sort of up to Berlin, right? I have a twin, Ruth Davis, who's we're like these 2 mad women, right? In a motorbike and a sidecar, driving around Whitehall, watch out. So she will take the lead on the nature aspects of forests, and we will work together on the financing of forests. But on energy, the government in opposition talked about a global clean power alliance. That was sort of soft launched together with President Lula at the G20. It's not another acronym in a world where there's 1,000 acronyms. I mean, it is an acronym, but what it's attempting to do is to bring leading countries, or countries that are committed to net zero and the energy transition, together in a political formation to try to remove the political roadblocks to the things that need to happen for the energy transition to happen. So we can, even if we had all of the trillions of dollars in our pocket today, they couldn't be invested successfully because of the sort of things that Avinash and I've talked about. So we're going to try to unblock some of the blockages. And then on finance, I'm going to become a friend of not but also the Treasury and Cabinet Office, because where we will need to have a coherent view across government about how we pull these levers that I talked about. So, the relationship with the IMF is managed by Treasury. The relationship with the MDBs is managed by different teams within the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. The relationship with the multilateral climate funds is managed by different teams in the Foreign Office and in DESNES. The relationship with BII is held by the Foreign Office. The relationship with PIDGE is held by a different team in the Foreign Office. Who is talking to the city about how the city can be leveraged? Well, that's DESNES and Department of Trade and Business Development. So how do we bring a whole of government approach to the need to find the way to speed this transition? So I think that's one of the tasks that I'll work with many others on, and I think it's very clear to the Foreign Secretary that this is climate is not a silo or a department within the Foreign Office. It is something which has to cut across. So finance, energy, and forests.
There's a lot of high-level stuff people talk about, so let me be very practical, the things I'm actually working on. So I'm always a little bit afraid that there's a bias towards announcements rather than actually implementation. So we announced $5.2 billion towards a way of reducing foreign exchange rate risk for investments in climate and nature positive projects in Brazil, but we don't have anything happening yet. So a big focus for the next 12 months for me is finding great investors and projects and taking them through that platform, getting great examples and helping to move that across the world. We're working a bit with the African Development Bank on seeing how we can partner with them. There is mitigation financing happening in a handful of developing countries. India and Brazil are two examples. But the banks are now maxing out on how much they can lend to those sectors. So we're trying to develop a fund that will buy the renewable energy loans in those countries. And then we will sell, so these are performing loans.
Yeah.
So when you go to investors around the world today, they'll say, oh, I'd love to go to emerging markets, but it's so risky. Will I get the permit, the foreign exchange, the government, the politics? So here are performing loans. They've already got the permit. And so we want to say, look, we're going to buy all these, put them together as a diversified portfolio, and sell those to the investors too afraid to go to the startup projects, but they've got some existing projects. We're trying to fund methane leak reduction. Methane is a major fast-acting pollutant. It actually it's self-financing. The methane that could be used for energy that you save from closing these leaks finances the closing of the leaks, but you need to have money up front. So we're looking at financing that. That's on mitigation. On adaptation, we're developing something we call IBB Klima. Why are countries underinvesting in resilience? It's too expensive. We've got problems with the IMF DSA, but even a 4%, 5% loan is expensive for many developing countries. So we're developing a system where it's called rewards for results. So we build a seawall. It's certified internationally as being resilient, saving the city on the other side of the seawall, and we ask donors, will they pay, not for the loan, we're paying the loan, will they pay half the interest? So the loan becomes a 2% loan for resilience. So they're faced with 5, 7, 10, 12% loans doing non-resilient stuff. They get a 2% loan from us doing resilience. We are working on the first one of that kind, not the first one, but we're doing extreme heat schools. Kids are going to school in Latin America and the Caribbean at 40 degrees heat. There's no learning. The loss of future income for those kids from that situation would pay many times over to cool those schools. But that's something that the government can see, the government who gets the taxes on their income, hard for anyone else to fund that. So we're creating a program to fund the adapting of schools. Painting roofs white reduces heat by 2 degrees. Planting green foliage reduces heat by another couple degrees. Changing airflow in a school reduces heat. So we've got a loan program. It costs about $70 per kid to make a school adapted for heat. And we're looking for donors who will come and pay half the interest once we've done that. I may well be knocking around on the doors here. And the final thing is we are doing two final things. We're doing the first ever regional debt swap. So these debt swaps are about taking a country's credit, weak credit, and turning them into a AAA rated credit. So the country is paying the same amount of interest, but the interest savings from having this credit enhancement we direct to marine or climate or other conservation. We're going to do, but the problem is they're small, these swaps, because we're talking about developing countries which tend to be small economies. And so the transaction costs, the legal costs of these swaps are high. So we're going to put them all together into one big regional debt swap. And the benefits of that, we're going to say to the countries, try to persuade them, can you not send a third of the revenue benefits to regional public goods? Regional public goods like regional health, regional food security, regional transport, regional early warning devices for climate impacts. Those are grossly underfunded, and as you might imagine. In the Caribbean, when a hurricane hits, the Regional Security Service is within 2 hours dropping water and food. They've only got 2 planes for the entire Caribbean. And those planes, one's a 1950s plane, and the other one I think is 1970 something. So regional public goods are underfunded, and we're trying to fund those. I don't think any of those things will be impacted by developments in the past month.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to open up the conversation. I feel inspired by the opportunities to innovate. And we've seen, what you're laying out that's happening in the Inter-American Development Bank, which is one institution which is really on the front foot with this. But we've seen so many other forms of innovation. As you spoke to about the solidarity levies, can we get some of these up and running and find political space, political narrative, which describes why these are not an out there proposition, but actually building on things that we're already doing. So I think there's a lot to discuss in terms of practical opportunities as well, obviously, as the difficult political context in which we sit for these issues. So with that, please very much welcome contributions, questions. I'll take them in threes, and a reminder to please introduce yourself. And Holly will bring the mic around. Thank you so much. So we'll go to Jonathan here first.
Morning everybody, thank you ever so much. Jonathan Byner from the Centre for Global Development. I think many people came out of Baku thinking that very unhappy with the deal. In spite of all the emphasis on learning lessons from the $100 billion goal, it appeared not to learn any at all. It's inadequate, unambitious, no emphasis on public finance, nothing on grant equivalence, clarity about new and additional was missing, etc., etc. Question, was this deal better than a no deal? Thank you.
Okay, let's take 2 more. And what's the front here? Can you pass that on?
Thank you. My name is Daphne Jayasinha from the International Rescue Committee humanitarian organisation. You mentioned that GDP and capacity are shaved by climate impacts and risk appetite is needed, both of you in your presentations. In conflict-affected countries where the IRC works, that's even more the case. That risk is really extremely high, and that the GDP capacity is shaped by both climate and conflict intersecting. In a handful of countries that are both conflict and climate vulnerable, we've identified 17 represents a third of people living in extreme poverty, a third of people affected by natural disasters in the last 3 years, and over 70% of humanitarian need, and yet climate finance is not flowing to those countries. MDB projects are disrupted by those shocks, but also region scale is disrupted by over-dependence or over-reliance on governments that are also affected by conflict, with more de facto authorities taking over part of all of the country. How can we make sure that conflict and climate affected communities aren't left behind, and how can the UK leverage its shareholder role, including as part of the IDA negotiations in the next week, which is a key source of climate finance.
And we'll go right to the back. Sorry, Holly.
Hello, I'm Flossie from Global Witness. My question was building on your introductions to the question round on solidarity levies and making the political space for that to feel like something that is more doable and less of an outlandish policy idea. This is kind of aimed at Rachel and to what extent solidarity levies and particularly seeking contributions from oil and gas companies and coal companies to pay for adaptation and loss and damage feel like a political, huge mountain to climb in the UK, and to what extent this is on the table.
Okay. Do you want to go first on this round, Adam, and then reverse it next time?
Baku. I think the point has been made many times correctly that much more is needed. That we can't put hope and prayer into private sector finance. It's not flowing. We need to do things to make it flow. But I think, one of the things one of the reasons why Bridgetown, I think, had traction is because we were a government, and we recognized people on the other side of the table were governments. They weren't individual philanthropists, they were governments who'd been elected. They'd been elected on a platform. And we're negotiating with people who had not been elected on a platform to double and treble climate finance and to send the money abroad. So they've not been elected on that platform. I don't think we can expect them to have a massive impact. I mean, what was supposed to happen? Ed would come back and say to Cabinet, I'm really sorry, but we've just made a huge commitment, which means that taxes have to go up by 4 or 5 pence, and we're slashing this budget and that budget to pay for it. I don't think they had a mandate to do that. So I think we had to get the maximum out of what was available with existing mandates. I think that's what the COP process is about, and I think COP helps do that. And therefore, I think this is a better deal than no deal. Because no deal is not, the alternative is that so what we need to do is do the political work that changes those mandates. And Jamie and others around this room, and Global Witness and others, that's what you do and playing a really important role. But you can't do that on the 2 weeks in COP. You have to do that through the year. Conflict states are a very challenging issue. You're much more of an expert on it than I would say I am. It doesn't fit in with our current sort of modus of operating. Multilateral development banks are owned by governments. And you're saying there's a set of governments, you're quite rightly saying, there's a set of governments that don't actually have any reach. There's a state of conflict. They're not perhaps legitimate. They can't even reach to the people if they were legitimate. They need a different modus of operandi. I don't think the development banks are able to manage that. And I don't think we can expect them too much to do that. We may need other institutions. A development bank cannot say, I don't care to the government, I don't care what you think, I'm going to do this in your country. You can't do that. They're sovereign. And we're a collection of sovereign governments. So you need another instrument, I think. I think it's very hard for the development banks to do that. And on the taxes, I went in November, I went to the Tokyo Global Maritime Forum to talk about emissions taxes in the shipping industry. And I was quite nervous because I thought, I'm going into the lion's den. I'm going to talk to a bunch of ship owners about taxing emissions. And I was amazed that actually they were in favor of it. Big industries, big companies often like regulation and taxation because they can outcompete the small ones at doing it. It's a real competitive boost for them. It's a barrier to entry to all other players. If there's an emission tax, who could pay it? I mean, it's going to be the big companies who own these boats, so the smaller the competitors won't be able to do it very much. So they were all for it. The people who are against it, actually developing countries. The problem at the IMO was Brazil, China, and a number of other countries felt they were going to pay for it because you can tax a company, but you know what they're going to do? Your shareholders aren't paying for it. Their consumers are paying for it. And I think the solution to that, my final point would be, we need to think about tax design. Think about these global solidarity levies. The same topics come up all the time: aviation, shipping, financial transactions, emissions, carbon. We don't need to have another committee to discuss what we need to tax. We need a committee to help us design those taxes that deals with those groups of people who feel they're being unfairly impacted. I mean, one of the things that I was led to think after Tokyo was, well, maybe for developing countries, the revenues from the emissions tax goes to the countries themselves, the importing country, but they can only spend it on decarbonisation. But they spend it first in their country on decarbonisation. So we need some design features around these levies.
So, first question on Baku, this deal or no deal, this deal. On conflict-affected countries, I think the UK will make its announcement on IDA very soon. It's going to be a substantial announcement, and I think IDA is the most effective way of getting cash into governments. I mean, it becomes difficult with conflict, but I think the fragile and conflict-affected states window in IDA is still one of the best vehicles we have, and I'm happy to talk offline about my experience of working in getting money into the right hands in conflict-affected countries. I think it's very difficult. And then just on taxes, so I completely agree with Avi that it's how to do this effectively. The UK, the current government changed its stance on the IMO process when it came into power, and that's, we've got a lot of work to do to get over the line in March, April next year, whenever it is. So I hope that you're all working on that. I did a lot of work with the global shipping, I forget the acronym now, but I remember doing some of the modelling around, what would happen, and I think it was like a US cent on a T-shirt if you put it on a ship with shipping taxes applied and things like that. So I think that where the burden of the tax falls, I think it's really important to understand, so that you don't allow the lobby to say, we're going to make everything more expensive. That happens all the time. But I would say that, so I think that there is an engagement with treasuries all over the world, including with the UK, around doing the work on the design. And so obviously France, Kenya, Colombia and others are leading a group that's looking at that. I think it would be interesting to see if other countries join that group, not because they're dedicated to levies, but in order to do the work, the technical work on how would these be designed to have the maximum impact and no perverse impacts, or limit the perverse impacts. And it's not for me to decide whether we do that or not. But the one thing I would say to this audience is that I think we're going to have a big hypothecation problem down the line, in that everybody who wants these levies and wants taxes, or whatever we're going to call them, also wants them to go to specific things. And there's no alignment on that, right? So we're going to do this, that has to go to loss and damage fund. We're going to do this will have to go. So we know that treasuries universally hate to hypothecate. The IMF hates hypothecation, right? So basically you raise the revenue goes to the government spends it according to government priorities. So I think that it was behooving of the community to make sure that we don't get into a big hypothecation mess down the line on the basis that there will be a preponderance of views that this is one of the most efficient ways to raise the revenues that we need. Then let's not get into a family fight over hypothecation. And that, I think that will be an interesting part of the debate as well.
Fantastic. Right, so let's take another round. Tom.
Thank you. So, Tom Clements from the Royal Foundation. Rachel, it was great to hear you say forests, because I care much about forests, and I realise it's not your specialty, so you can punt on the question if you want. But forests are the sort of classic public goods problem, actually some way similar to adaptation finance. If you look at the parts of climate investment that are growing as renewable energy, so as a business model, there isn't really a business model for forests. So how could the new government help try and create that forest finance flow in a way that moves beyond public donor funds? And then as a precursor to argument or to potential answers, what's your views either on the big Brazil TFFF idea of tropical forest growth facility, and or how government could actually regulate to scale forest carbon credits? Thanks.
Thank you. Angela Francis from WWF, and it's a slightly connected question. Yeah, thank you for your remarks, and I was pleased to hear you also both mention climate and nature together. We've had more examples around energy and infrastructure, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on food and farming, which I think connects to Tom's point about forests. It's such an important area for the economies of the global south, for their mitigation and adaptation as well. And I totally agree with Rachel, your point around this being around terms of trade and cost of capital and national competitiveness in those industries. We have had some conversations around CBAMs and other things for industrial goods, but there's not much happening or being co-created on what is the pathway to sustainable agriculture for developing countries, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Fantastic. Okay, Jamie.
Thank you. This is more on the, Jamie Drummond, sharing strategies and more on the politics side than the policy. And it's probably as much for the room as the panel, which is we have a comprehensive multi-annual spending review in March, probably. So the decisions made in October covered one period of time, this covered the longer one, which in theory goes through to when this country hosts the G7 and a G20. And to the length as Parliament. So, to all the climate and development and nature groups in the room, we need to get our collective case for investment very well organised and articulated in the next very short period of time in order to help our friends, our dear friends in Treasury, make some bold decisions, which of course, make the win-win argument for why this is in the British citizens' interests, short, medium, long term. Traditionally, the UK has been a great host of G7 and G20 summits, especially under a Labour government. So there's reasons to understand and be optimistic, but not if we're not highly strategic and organised. And I spend a fair amount of time doing diplomatic work in climate development and nature groups. I think we could do a bit better at working together and making a collective case. It's incredibly important that we do that. So I'd love sort of the panel's reflections on what the opportunity is in the next very short period of time, between now and March, to make the argument. And what sort of arguments are working best with our dear friends in Treasury?
Great. I'll hand back to the panel and hopefully we'll have time for one more round. I think we will have to conclude a few minutes early. Go on, Rachel.
So I'll be brief. I can't answer all of the. I'm happy to have a longer conversation about forest finance and whatever another day. But the TFFF is a very important deliverable for COP30. I think the Brazilians have gone out early and strong on it at the highest political level, And so across Whitehall there are teams working on the front end and the back end, right? So on the forest end of it and on the mobilisation. So TFFF is this a way to raise substantial amounts of capital from long-term investors, sovereigns and others into standing tropical forests. So you've got to get the forest bit of it right, and you've got to get the pitch to the sovereigns right. So I think we see, and the UK-Brazil relationship is very close, and it's going to become closer. And we've committed to work together on a whole series of issues in the run-up to COP30, and so TFF is one of those, I think. So I won't say more now. I'm going to punt the food and farming thing because that's a seminar all of itself, but I think there's a lot to be done there around. There's all kinds of things which make this not work, including like logistics and investment into that sector, all kinds of structural problems, including the price of food and all the rest of it. And I think that some of the work that the World Bank's done on this is really good. It's got to be operationalised. And then it's a question to the room. I would just say that spending, I mean, it's now, not much. I mean, don't come in February with ideas. It's now. I think that would be my only thing I would say.
So it's taken about an hour and 15 minutes before Richard and I had a slight difference in emphasis. I don't believe voluntary credits are going to work. Voluntary climate credits, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, nature credits, they haven't worked. We spent 20 years trying to make them work. 20 years. And the entire market after 20 years is $2 billion and falling. We need $2.4 trillion of finance. The entire voluntary carbon market is $2 billion. The compliance market in Europe is worth $800 billion. Compliance markets work. Governments setting the price for carbon and having tax implications for you emitting it, that works. And I said to my economics friends, Alfred Pigou came up with the framework for these social externalities. Right? If you're emitting pollution, you need to find a way of dealing with it. He didn't say it's going to be solved voluntarily. The private sector will voluntarily just stop polluting. No, the government had to tax it, subsidize good stuff and tax bad stuff. And I think, so I worry about the forestry proposals. Forestry is critical. But to me, they're an extension of biodiversity credits, and biodiversity credits are an extension on the thing that has failed, carbon credits. I think it's very important in Berlin that we come up with a solution on forestry. I think the solution is around sustainable agriculture. 90% of the deforestation in Brazil is illegal. So it isn't a lack. It isn't because they don't have the right laws. And what they've been doing is, during Lula's first administration, they were quite effective of identifying when something was happening and bringing in security forces to try and address it. And they've done some of that this time around too. But the problem is security forces leave and deforestation goes on afterwards. We have to change the livelihoods. There are millions of people living in the Amazon. We have to change the livelihoods. And agriculture is a unique space which matches adaptation and mitigation. And it's a unique space where adaptation, resilient seeds, sustainable agriculture actually makes money. So I think there's a solution there. It's around sustainable agriculture. It's around doing things sustainable for which we may be able to find people with good income and livelihoods. But basing it on voluntary credits, I think it's going to be very hard for that to work. And I have to say, I believe in reviewed evidence, reviewed preferences. It has not worked. And I don't think it's about integrity. I think the reason why integrity is so low is because the price is so low. And the price is so low because it's voluntary. When your price is 2% of what it should be, where's the money to invest in integrity? Where's the money to invest in monitoring and evaluating? It doesn't exist. So in fact, the integrity bit is directly linked to the price bit. And just boosting integrity, if it doesn't change prices, it's not going to work. I'm afraid. I would like it to work. But it would be odd for it to work. I mean, that's the weird thing about this. It would be very odd for us to manage to do this voluntarily. Because there are very few things we do voluntarily. It'd be very odd for it to work, and it hasn't worked. And we have plenty of evidence that it hasn't worked. I don't understand why there's all this emphasis on it, actually. A few years ago, you couldn't go to a conference without half of it on some fancy new, clever credit scheme. And if you look at them, they're not delivering.
Fantastic. Right, let's try for one more round. Okay, so go to the lady in the back there.
Thank you. I'm Yolanda Wright. I'm from a not-for-profit called Give Directly, but previously UK Government and Save Children. So thanks for your early comments. I've got two quick questions. One is you talked about stop subsidising bad stuff. Do you think enough is being done to stop subsidising fossil fuels? I still hear a lot about we're still subsidising fossil fuels much more than we are providing finance for renewables, etc. So I'd just love your comments on that. And then secondly, I don't think direct cash to poor people is the only solution by any means, but I do think that there's a huge amount of climate finance that doesn't reach the front lines, doesn't reach people, either for loss and damage finance or actually to support livelihood adaptation, supporting indigenous people to kind of conserve their own forests. Could you comment briefly on could more be done to transparently ensure that some of that climate finance is directly reaching individual people on the front line of the crisis? Thanks.
Great. Holly will go here to Duncan and then here to the front row, and then we'll have some final comments.
So Duncan Hames, Transparency International. I was intrigued to hear you specifically mention conditionality in your opening remarks. Do you think proposals developed with private investors for governance-linked bonds can make a contribution to reducing the cost of capital by addressing specifically country risk in some of these developing economies?
Thank you very much, Fiona Harford from The Guardian. The definition of the 300 billion that's going to come from the 12th round that's in the text is it should come from a wide variety of sources, public and private, bilateral, multilateral and alternative sources. While some people are getting very exercised about that, they're saying that one of the words sound, they're saying it's effectively meaningless. How wide should we be about that definition? Thank you.
So on the, I was a little bit concerned about the definition, but the way the OECD is going to measure the NCQG, the New Collective Quantifiable Goal contribution by developed countries, is including, besides grants, their MDB contributions, multilateral development bank contributions, it is mobilized private sector, which is private sector that is blended with the multilateral development bank or co-invested. That's not just private sector on its own. And so there is actually a difference. Fiona, I had a similar anxiety when I saw the wording on its own, but then if you read the entire document and look at the way it's measured, I think that there is a distinction, because you're right, and I think I may have said it to you and others. You have to make sure that the core is different in character than the outer number. It's got to be. It's got to be the thing that is helping us to drive to the outer number. So it has to be more grounded in public finance. But I think that's the way it's going to be measured. In terms of governance bonds, I think that's interesting. I haven't seen one that has worked yet. Sustainability linked bonds is an attempt to do something like that. I have to say there's been a green bond revolution in terms of issuance, lots of green bonds. The measure of it is whether the yield on those green bonds are dramatically lower than the yield on the non-green bonds, right? Because the idea is that because you're doing something green, there's an extra capital prepared to go there for less return, and there is almost no difference between the green bond and the non-green bond. It's about 4 or 5 basis points. It's nothing. So I have to say, so far, it's not clear that I haven't seen things that work very well that have been scalable. There are a few exceptions. Finally, on subsidies, I think that this is more complicated than people appreciate. Most governments, you say to them, you're subsidizing fossil fuels, they'll say, no, I'm subsidizing heat for pensioners at Christmas time. That's a fossil fuel subsidy. I'm subsidizing the poorest people. I remember when, do you remember when oil prices went up to 120? I was in an island, my leader was a climate warrior, a very impressive lady, and she wanted to subsidize petrol prices. And I argued against it. And she said, that's fine in your theoretical world, but the people today who are at the edge of poverty have now been pushed into poverty by the fact that their petrol prices have gone up. So these are not so easy. So you often hear this phrase, repurpose subsidies. I think that is what we have to end up doing, and repurposing them so that the people who need support are getting support, but that support is not dependent on their consumption of fossil fuels. They may be dependent on their consumption of energy, but not on fossil fuels. And then to your final bit, cash transfers are very effective. They've been pioneered a lot in Latin America. And we're coming up with something I'd say as adaptive transfers. So for example, we can predict extreme heat days at least 2 days in advance. And so we're looking at ways of adding to a cash transfer an extreme heat payment to come the day before to stop the desperate need for low-income people to be working and outside of those days.
So very quickly, so invite us back so I can really get into the whole question of carbon markets with Abby, because I didn't get into it and then he went off on a rant. We agree, and then there's a few things we disagree on. On subsidies, it's harmful subsidies, right? So it is there's a reason why in the World Bank Group, the team that leads on fossil fuel subsidy reform is not anywhere near the climate or environment team. It's run by the safety nets team, because you've got to find ways to make sure that through shocks, etc., that people can afford energy. And there's been a lot of, I think, lots of really good experimentation in many countries where it's worked. Right? But I was struck by a conversation I had with the finance minister of Angola during the IMF annual meetings this year. I think 4% of her GDP is going to fossil fuel subsidies, right? So I mean, the need to get out from under is there. So I think it is complicated, but it needs to be a focused and sustained effort. Cash transfers, I believe in cash transfers. I also think that we should start bringing some of these things into, so for example, clean cooking, right? So there's lots of innovation on what kind of gadget people can cook with, women can cook with, that's cleaner. But if you put cash into the hands of women, they will demand what they want and what they need. And I think we could be even more aggressive about this. And I was really struck, I don't know if anybody bothers to listen to Radio 4 in the morning, but yesterday Mona Siddiqui was on Thought for the Day, really, I thought, brilliant sort of exposition on charity and the difference between charity and development, and it really made me think about cash transfers, so keep doing what we're doing. That's my personal view, it's my government view. Then Abby answered your question, Fiona, so I won't. And then what was the last one? I think that, so again on bond issues, so I think the ones that get talked about as being leaders of the pack really are what Chile and Uruguay did with their bond issue around their own sustainable development targets, right? So this is what we're going to, and I think that I haven't thought about it in the way that you articulated, but I would look at what they did and see whether there's application. Thank you. And I've got a reputation for running out of the room before Q&A in Baku. I know that. I'm about to it's not personal. Sorry.
Before Rachel leaves, can you just give a huge round of applause? Thank you. Just wanted to check Olivia if you wanted to say anything before we close.
I think you've got it covered. Okay, but thank you to everyone, and I reiterate my point about do let us know what you think would be interesting to us for us to cover in the future series, and looking forward to chatting to you afterwards.
And that's it. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you so much, Avinash and Richard, just at the back there for an incredibly stimulating hour and a half. Thank you.